Hello and welcome to this Illustrator tutorial. We're going to start by looking at some of the basics in Illustrator. Most of you are familiar with Photoshop, but Illustrator there are similarities and differences, and I'm just going to go through some of the basics now with you. First of all, you open the Adobe Illustrator app in the same way you'd open the Adobe Photoshop app. It's exactly the same process, and you'll get this start page. And obviously, create new is the first thing we do. When you press create new, you get this information box, which gives you a very similar information flow to Photoshop. And again, you've got a range of options. The option I'm particularly interested in this morning is print, and then A4, and doesn't really matter orientation, portrait or landscape. You can choose, so portrait and landscape is absolutely fine. What's useful to know here is artboards. So artboards is something, it's the similarity, same process of creating canvases in Photoshop, multiple canvases, but in Illustrator they're called artboards, and you can create multiple artboards, and you'll see what happens when you create. You'll have essentially two artboards on the page. Everything else you can obviously define, so you've got millimeters or centimeters, and you can define the size, the width and the height of the page. Let's not worry about bleed just yet, because that's more of the printing term. Color mode, again, we don't need to worry too much about. RGB, CMYK, we'll stick to CMYK at the moment. Resolution is quite important. So resolution, high resolution, 300 pixels per inch. And then obviously you've got screen resolution, which is essentially an image that is designed to work on the internet as a web image. So obviously you don't need as much information, as much pixels per inch. We're going for 300 ppi, and then create. And you should have two artboards appear on your page as so. Again, in similarity, similar characteristics to Photoshop, you've got the toolbar, which you can see me moving around here, and then you've got the window, obviously the menu, top menu here, including window, and you can also see that you've got your two artboards here, 1 and 2. Yeah, and you can just center your pages using the scroller there. So what I want to do first of all is talk about the tools here. So you've got essentially a move tool, which is called direct selection tool, and then the selection tool. We'll stick to the direct selection tool for the time being. That essentially means that you can move objects around. The selection tool in Illustrator means that you can manipulate shapes by clicking on the anchor points, but I'll show you that in a few seconds. All I want to do initially is just to talk about the rectangle tool, which is here. So you've got a range of shape tools. Let's just look at the rectangle tool for the time being. What's important, not necessarily before you draw a shape, but to understand, is that within appearances on the right hand side dialog box, you've got fill and stroke. If I set fill to none, and then stroke is currently black, so if I click on the dialog box for the stroke, you can obviously change the color of the stroke. The stroke is the border of your shape. So in theory, we should have a pink border. Now it's barely visible. If I click on just outside of the box, it's barely visible, but it is actually there. If I select the rectangle again and then increase the point, you should see that the border is increasing. Okay, that's great. So if I want to add a fill, as in fill in the negative space there, then let's have a look here. So you can choose a range of options to fill in that space. You can just choose whatever color combinations you want for that positive space. Let's just go with yellow for the time being. So there is essentially your rectangle. Because what you're doing is you're generating an abstract drawing, you're generating an image which is just a combination of shapes, forms, and obviously you can bring images in from the web as well. But for the time being, let's just look at this shape. Now, I've talked about the direct selection tool. Let's talk about the selection tool. You can see that when I click on the selection tool, your white bounding boxes appear here. Okay. And obviously what you can do there is you can increase and decrease the size of your shape. So this is like essentially it's similar to the free transform tool in Photoshop. And again, I'm manipulating the rotation. And if you hold down Shift whilst you're manipulating the rotation, you can see that it locks 90 degrees and 45 degrees. So you can manage the rotation if you want to. Let's just lock it there. If I then go so on the direct selection tool, what I've done is I've double clicked on the anchor point, and you'll have to practice this, which is the entire point of this exercise. But you can then manipulate the anchor points that should be on each point of the line, and you can just generate an abstracted shape or an arrow, as it were. You can add anchor points, but that's jumping ahead a little. So the add anchor point tool within the pen tool, and that essentially just means that you can then manipulate those points too. So let's add some more anchor points. So back to the pen tool, add anchor point tool, just add some more anchor points, back to the direct selection tool. You can see that they're white, which means that you can access them and manipulate the shape. Okay, back to a selection tool, so I can now move my object around. And again, you can change the color and the stroke of your object. And you can change the size. So again, holding down Shift, you retain, it's very similar to Photoshop, you're retaining the proportions in Photoshop. So it's the same Illustrator and Photoshop, so you can manage the positioning of this shape. One more thing I'll show you before we stop, because I want you to experiment with this, is how to duplicate a shape. Now in Photoshop, it's you press Alt and you effectively duplicate the shape. It's exactly the same in Illustrator. So you press Alt on your keyboard, and then move the mouse, click on the mouse, and then you can manipulate and duplicate the shape. So you're duplicating exactly the same shape to again produce more of an abstracted pattern within the canvas. At this point, you can also decide, well, actually, I want some additional shapes. So you might choose an additional shape. Using a selection tool to move this shape around, I'm going to change the color. So you can change the color, and I want to change the stroke. Maybe I don't want a stroke, so you can have none for that, and then you've got that shape there. Again, to produce multiple versions, you just press Alt on your keyboard and then click on the mouse, and you can produce multiple versions. So let's have a go at just exploring shapes, the stroke tool, the fill tool, and the direct selection tool and the selection tool to manipulate that image. What's important, really important, because we need to save everything we do as examples of your work. So we need to go to, and again, the same process that's in Photoshop, File, Save As, name it something memorable, so test in this case, and save it to your memory stick or desktop. Ideally your memory stick, but it may have to be to your desktop for the time being, and then just press save. Once you press save, you'll get a range of options, because we're not worrying too much about this detail, just press OK. And it'll save it as an Illustrator file. It's an AI file, but that just means that you can open it up in Photoshop as well and manipulate it in Photoshop. Hopefully that is clear. Wonderful. Now it's time to experiment. Thanks for watching.